Hello to listeners. I'm Leo McBride, and a little while ago on my Twitter, I said that if I got so many retweets of a certain tweet, I would do a recording of my short story from the Tales from Alternate Earths anthology. That's the first of the Tales from Alternate Earths anthologies. The third one of which is open to submissions now. Submissions closing at the end of this month. In case any of you wanted to have a tilt at such an anthology. So the story that I wrote for it is called The Secret War. I won't say too much about it now. I'll go straight into the reading, but I'll go into it afterwards and have a little chat about where the idea came from and a bit more about the twist in the setting. It's an alternate history. Although afterwards, after it was published, somebody correctly identified that it's not quite an alternate history, but more of a secret history, because the world remains the same as it always was. But this just tells a secret part of that history that hitherto we did not know. So, without further ado, let me read to you The Secret War. It seems almost unimaginable to me now how the events of the past few hours unfolded. Only this morning, when roused by the call from Huxley, I would scarce have imagined it myself. Looking back now, as I sit in the safety of a train carriage taking me away from the scene of such horror, his calm, measured tone seems so far away from the last words I heard from him, his cry of, "Run for it, Bertie!" I recall the fear in his voice, and then the pain in my shoulder as the hand of the artilleryman detailed to guard the civilian investigators gripped me hard and pushed me towards Benz's automobile contraption. As I sat now in this carriage, it seemed harder still to believe. Around me, families filled the carriage, parents playing with children or set to reading or discussions, oblivious to the threat that came last night, threatening to wash away this world of ours. "Run for it!" Huxley had cried. And God help me, I did. It was a matter of wonder to me that after all that had happened, the world around me continued with such normality. I felt alone, separated from the everyday routines around me. My skin still stung from the heat and flames, and the voices, the screams, still haunted me. I closed my eyes and let the movement of the train lull me into what I knew would be a restless, fevered sleep. The sudden halt of the train jolted me awake. For a moment everything seemed to be an impossible fantasy, but as I became more aware of my surroundings, I noticed the happy, eager chatter of conversation by the families had changed. Parents comforted children, husbands whispered cautiously to wives, and all strained to look out the window to one side of the carriage. The clatter, clatter, clap, rap of the train's idle passage had ceased, yet we stood in open fields, not the destination of the London station, for which I had forsaken my journey home and my dear Jane. Straightening my clothes, I too rose and leaned as far as I could to see what may have halted the carriage. Ahead lay a railway crossing, and lined along it were members of a company of soldiers, with rifles held ready and a Maxim parked close by. Troops down from the barracks at Aldershot, if I wasn't mistaken. I felt it was time to take my leave, retrieved my hat from my seat, and made my way to the end of the carriage, disembarking on the far side of the train. My papers tucked safely in my briefcase, I stepped briskly along the beaten road alongside the track, stifling a cough as I walked. I soon gained my bearings. Not far away was Stroud, where I could perhaps find a wagoner heading north. I chanced to glance behind me towards the train to see soldiers forcing people off into a field. "Run," Huxley had said. He certainly hadn't intended for me to be stopped before I could tell people what I witnessed on the common. The walk had quite taken the breath from me as I reached the edge of Stroud, just as the sun was setting. The community was peaceful, quiet, and again I was struck by the stark difference from what I had witnessed earlier that day, and the quiet pace of the rest of the world, untouched as it was by the news of the incident at the common. Little would I have suspected such occurrences when I awoke this morning, I mused. I could hardly fault the rest of the world for the same. "Had a long walk?" I started at the voice. In my reverie I had fallen into introspection, not noticing the figure now standing in the garden beyond the wall where I rested. I looked up at the man. "Are you the parson?" I asked. He smiled and shook his head. "The curate," he replied, before adding with a note of concern, "Are you well? You look weary." "Have you any water?" I asked abruptly. He nodded. "I'll go get you a glass. One moment." A sound came echoing to my ears along the road, the sound of booted feet marching on the roadway. I paused for a moment, then beckoned to the curate. "Forgive me," I said. "Would you mind if I took a seat inside while I drank? The dust of the road." Again he nodded, and I rose, brushed off my hat, and followed him inside. "Did you see the falling star last night?" he asked, as I sipped the water and watched the window facing the road. I looked towards him and shook my head no. "I was in the garden," he continued. "Often on an evening I like to sit in the garden and look towards the sky. I find it helps me meditate on God's word. That's when I saw it, the falling star, passing through the evening sky with a hissing sound, leaving a green trail behind it. It fell somewhere south of here." The sound of boots was close now, and we both paused and looked as the company of soldiers passed by, the Maxim gun in their wake. "Where do you suppose they are going?" asked the curate. I shrugged. We sat in silence for a while, until the soldiers had passed from sight and sound. I sipped the cool water to soothe the cough in my throat. "What do you suppose it meant?" he asked. I looked up at him. "What do I suppose what meant?" I asked. "The falling star," he said. Again I shrugged. "You're the man of God," I said. "Aren't you the one to provide meaning?" He rose and paced to the window. "I wonder," he said, "because in all the days I have lived here, I have never seen a column of soldiers come by like that, let alone pulling a gun with them. And it occurs to me this happens the very day after I see a sign in the heavens. Did you come from the south? Did you see anything there?" "I came off a train from Woking," I said. "Soldiers were stopping the trains. I decided to try to find another way. I'm just a traveller, no more than that." "You don't think the falling star meant anything?" he pressed. Again I showed disinterest, suppressing a cough and sipping my water. "And the third angel sounded," he said, "and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of waters. And the name of the star is Wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the waters, because they were made bitter." He paused. "You know the passage? You are a Christian, sir?" I inclined my head. "Revelation," I replied. "As to the latter, I fear if I called myself a Christian, I might imply too much, and thus tell a lie." He sniffed. "Are you a Sunday believer, sir? One of those men who prays on a schedule then conveniently forgets until the calendar reminds him once more?" I sipped my drink again. "Not at all, though I think my belief is in more of a personal and intimate God than many might appreciate. But what does God have to do with a falling star?" He sat again, opposite me, and levelled his gaze. "If the star brings destruction," he said, softly. "Everything, sir. Everything." We sat in silence for some time, until finally the curate spoke again. "You're headed north, toward London," he said. I nodded. "It's getting late. Perhaps you should rest here. On the main street is a bar. I might not approve of what he does, but the landlord is a good enough man. He has a horse and cart. I could speak to him. You could get a ride with him tomorrow, I'm sure." I thought of the soldiers back on the road and concurred. And so we spent the evening talking, him trying to convince me of the error of my ways and the signs in the sky that foretold of the end times, while I kept my counsel as best I could and refused to tell him of the horrors I had seen, lest they feed the fire to go with his brimstone. For all his strange talk, the curate was good to his word, and the next morning I rested in the back of a cart as the landlord's assistant carried me north. He carried me as far as Staines, where we parted, and I was able to send a telegram to Pearson at my destination before boarding an omnibus that clattered its way steadily towards the centre of London. It was evening again by the time the omnibus reached Fulham, Passengers came and went through the day, but I kept to myself through the journey, scribbling notes on all I had seen to present to Pearson when I saw him. Twice more during the day we passed soldiers, each group headed south. The first was a column of hussars, the second a team pulling artillery. Each time I kept my face from the window, tucking my hat lower over my face. At Fulham, I engaged a hansom cab to carry me further into London itself. The streets were packed, with people going about their early evening business. Workers headed home or started to spill out towards bars for their evening carousal. Theatre-goers passed in other cabs bound for the West End. News hawkers shouted the headlines as they held up their copies of the Times or the Telegraph. I bid the cab driver stop while I obtained a copy of the evening's paper and scoured the pages for any details about the incident on the Common. I was able to find only 2 items. A page 5 story detailing an army exercise taking place there that might prove a disruption to local travel. And then, on page 14, an item that made me pause, sigh, and wipe a tear from my eye. There, in black and white in the paper of record, was an obituary for Huxley, my old teacher, whose voice I could still hear ringing in my ears. I pored over every word, though much of it I knew by heart already. My old biology teacher, Darwin's bulldog, survived by his wife, Henrietta, 2 sons and 4 daughters. Then came the lie. He died in Eastbourne, the article said, of a heart attack after suffering influenza. I recalled those days at the normal school of science where he would smile and caution me, trying to learn something about everything and everything about something. And yet it was his last words I kept hearing. Run for it, Bertie. An old man, 70 years of age by his obituary, yet he had wrestled with those officers long enough to give me a head start, along with the artilleryman, that nameless artilleryman he had arranged as a dog's body to get me to the Bends and thence to the train. I feared I would never know someone quite so brave again. It was well settled into evening by the time the hansom glided me through the streets to my destination in the East End. All around the offices of the area were closed, and the hansom skittered away from the bright lights of the pubs on the street corners to the building I was bound for. "You sure this is the place, Gov?" asked the driver as I put money in his hand. I nodded and indicated with a tilt of my brow the upstairs window in which a light still burned. He took latters enough, tucking the money into his inside pocket, and the hansom slid away. I walked to the door with the sign overhead reading Pearson's Digest and tried the door. It was unlocked, for which I was thankful, and I quickly stepped inside off the street. In the dim light afforded by the moon, I could see the stairs ascending in front of me and carefully made my way up. The light of Pearson's office framed the doorway at the top. I doffed my hat and tapped twice. "Arthur, it's me, Bertie," I said. "Did you get my telegram?" There was silence on the other side. I tapped again. "Arthur," I called, but broke into a brief fit of coughing which I quelled by pressing the back of my hand against my mouth. I tried the handle. It turned in my hand. I pushed it open, squinting a little into the light beyond the frame. "Arthur, are you there?" I called. "Why aren't you—" I was interrupted by the sight of the red uniform of a Coldstream Guard and the rifle butt he lifted and unceremoniously struck into my face. It was the sound of screaming that awakened me. I was in a dingy stone room, its walls smeared with years of dirt. Grey laid on grey laid on grey. I laid on a cot that hardly seemed much better. Worse, my hands were secured to it. I strained against the bonds, but they were too tight. There was a high window in the room, again mostly darkened with age and filth, but enough light filtered through it to show me it was daytime. Had I been here overnight? I felt weary, and yet my breathing felt easier. Whatever had been ailing me seemed to have ceased. "Hello," I called, or croaked, rather in the manner of someone who has not spoken in some time. "Is anyone there?" I heard a noise outside. A moment passed, then came the sound of a key turning heavily in the lock. The door opened, and there, standing in the frame of the door, was another Coldstream Guard, the bright red of his uniform in stark contrast to the bland dullness of the room. "What's going on?" I demanded of him. pulling at my restraints to show him how I was tied, as if he didn't already know. He glanced at them, then at me, before replying, "You'll be just fine, Gov. They'll be here to see you soon. I'll let them know you're awake." With that, he closed the door. The key turned once more, and I was alone again. I counted as best I could in my head how long it was before the key turned again, and marked it to 20 minutes or so. When the door opened, the guard stepped inside to confirm my bonds were still tied, before stepping outside again to make way for the contingent accompanying him. First, an orderly placed 3 chairs in front of the bed, before leaving, as 3 men in suits settled themselves across from me. The orderly left, and the guard closed and locked the door once more. Of the 3 men, I recognized 2 of them. Ogilvy, the astronomer, was one. The other was a surprise, the German scientist Löffler, Friedrich Löffler. I'd met him once at a conference, but why he was here was baffling to me. The man in the middle, who began perusing a folder as he sat down, I did not know. "Where am I?" I demanded. The man in the middle closed the folder on his knee. "Newgate," he said. "It seemed the safest plan, considering, until such time as we knew your situation." "My situation? Or were you planning on doing away with me the way you did with Huxley? Who are you? And you, Ogilvy, Löffler, what are you doing here?" Ogilvy fidgeted and looked at the unannounced man, but remained silent. Löffler crossed his arms and waited. "My name is Archibald Henderson," said the man in charge, "and I work for the War Office, and you, sir, have been here for a week while we inspected you." "Inspected me?" I asked. "For what?" "For your well-being. You appeared to be unwell. How unwell we had to take precautions over." "But a week," I began. "What about the common?" "Perhaps we should begin with what you remember about what happened at Horsell Common and why you fled the scene." "Run for it, Bertie." Huxley's cry again ran through my head. And again I could almost feel the grip of the artilleryman on my shoulder. And yet, as I remembered it clearly now and told it to those 3 men, those were the moments of hope against the despair I shuddered to recollect. I had arrived at the common to find a cordon had already blocked off the area around the object. The object. That's what Lord Milton had called it as he pulled up in his Benz to examine it more closely, parting the soldiers to allow him access. Huxley had ushered me through with Milton as we moved closer. From our closer vantage point, what we had assumed had been some rock from the skies had been more remarkable still. It was smooth and appeared fashioned as if in some workshop. Huxley was the first to point out it looked like a cylinder. "Man-made?" asked Milton, but Huxley spent some time looking carefully at the object, then at the sky and the crater in which we stood, before solemnly, ruefully shaking his head. A team from the Royal Corps of Engineers arrived not long after and set about trying to get close to the cylinder despite the heat it radiated. A crowd had formed, and a young member of the Corps named Wagstaff had organised a line of locals to pass buckets of water from a nearby pond to throw onto the exterior of the cylinder to cool it down. Huxley bridled at the effort as unnecessary, saying time would do the job well enough, and we retired with Lord Milton for a spot of lunch at his manor house. When we returned, more soldiers still had arrived, and the crowd had swollen in size. I shifted uneasily to see young and old, men and women lined up at the edge of the crater. "Is it safe for them to be here?" I muttered to Huxley, but he shrugged, saying, "We know little and nothing in this matter, Bertie, and when that is so, who is to say when we are out of danger?" And so we hunkered down too, watching alongside those who had gathered to see whatever might emerge from this cylinder. Some of the young children I remember set to playing in the crater itself before being shooed away by young men in uniform. In the horror that followed, I wanted to believe that might have saved them. It was shortly after time for afternoon tea when the horror began. For all the work of the young engineers, little or nothing had occurred when, suddenly, a sound came from inside the cylinder itself. My voice cracked as I told the 3 men of what happened next, of the sound of the cylinder unscrewing, of how the lid fell off, and of how we all backed away as we caught the first glimpse of that strange, otherworldly being, with its glistening, leathery skin, slowly emerging. Transfixed as I was by the creature, it was the details that stuck in my brain. The woman nearby who swooned, the youngsters who scampered away, frightened by what they saw, the soldiers tightening their grips on their guns as their officers urged them to stand easy. Stand easy. Milton stared into life first. I might have a terrible intolerance for the aristocracy, but if nothing else, they are useful feeling they have to do something. He called to the officer in charge and urged him to send some men forward. The officer complied. And that is when the second terrible thing emerged from the cylinder. Rising up and taking aim at the advancing men and unleashing the fearful weapon these creatures brought with them. "The heat ray, that's what we've called it," said Ogilvy. "Deadly to anything it touches." "You don't need to tell me," I growled in reply. "I saw what it can do. Those men, they were gone in an instant. And then the weapon turned on the crowd. I wouldn't be here myself if Huxley hadn't grabbed hold of me and pushed me away from the pit. We ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it." Henderson interrupted. "Yes," he said. "That may be a problem." "A problem," I repeated, my tone betraying no small amount of anger. "What manner of men would not take shelter in the face of these Martians?" filled in Ogilvy. I looked at him, agog. "Martians?" "Yes, that appears to have been the point of origin of the object. However, we're still trying to verify the information in consultation with other observatories." Henderson hushed him. "What happened next?" he asked me. "You didn't just run. You ran somewhere in particular. Why did you come to London?" As we sheltered behind a bank of sand away from the blast of the heat ray, Huxley had quickly told me his plan. People had to know, he told me. There would be more troops along soon, he was sure, and they would bombard this thing, and that would be that. But this was something that belonged in more places than government files. He knew my writing. He knew I could get the word out. The captain of the unit stationed there overheard and started to remonstrate with him, but he pushed me away and told me to make a break for it, to borrow Milton's automobile and go. As the heat ray hissed again and flame spat up along the edges of the pit, that's when I heard the last words he would say to me. "Run for it, Bertie." "That's about what we expected," said Henderson. "You realize, of course, we can't possibly let that happen." I glared at him. "How are you going to stop me?" He looked at me as I laid in the bed in the tiny cell and raised an eyebrow. "It would appear from where I'm sitting we already have." I pulled hard at the restraints again. "Is that it? Are you going to keep me locked up here forever? People will soon see the truth regardless when whatever's in that pit finds a way to move." "Ah," he tutted, "there we have an advantage. That is never going to happen. The creatures are quite dead." "Dead?" I paused, recalling what Huxley had said to me in that urgent, whispered conversation. "You brought up more troops, deployed the rest of the artillery, shelled that thing until it was no more, right?" Henderson shook his head. "Not at all. That would be a terrible waste. Imagine all that technology. It was far too valuable a target to destroy. Goodness, no. Fortunately, something entirely different came to our aid. Loeffler, care to fill him in? I'm sure I would only stumble over the notes myself." The German, who had remained silent thus far, uncrossed his arms. "My apologies, old colleague, that we might meet again in this way," he began, his English heavily accented. "I believe it was at the Crystal Palace we last met at the biology conference." I inclined my head, though this was hardly the situation for pleasantries. "We were lucky, old colleague," said the scientist. "Or perhaps it was inevitable. Whichever it is, it was not us who defeated these creatures, these Martians." He said the word hesitantly, as if he scarcely believed it himself still. "No, not us," he continued. "Rather the tiniest of allies, bacteria. Wherever these creatures came from, they could fight our mightiest army, they could fight our strongest weapons, but they could not fight the merest bacteria. It attacked them the moment they opened the hatch. It worked into their bodies. It killed them from the inside out. They had no immunity as we do to such bacteria. We are born and grow up getting used to it. Every day we get filthy, we get exposed to it, we adapt, we thrive. They, wherever they are from, have never had that opportunity. It hit them hard, and that, my friend, is the one area where we were lucky." Not just that, harumphed Henderson, but already we have scientists starting to examine their weaponry, the exterior of their craft. Already we have a fellow from the Oldbury Wagon and Carriage Company speculating on what could be done with that armour on one of those automobile contraptions. I growled at him again. War. These creatures hopelessly outclassed us, and we survived because of luck, because of Mother Nature, and your first thoughts turned to war. Well, my dear sir, replied Henderson, one never knows the chances of more of these creatures coming, this time prepared for whatever it was that killed them. Said Ogilvy, I would say the chances are around 1,000,000. No one wants to hear your odds, interrupted Henderson. The point is, Britain has survived, and it might as well ballyuse what it has gained to strengthen the empire. Goodness knows there are threats, both external and internal, and we need to be strong. Strong, I spat. Is that what you call it? Locking me away in Newgate prison to shut me up, and killing off Huxley. Is that what you call strong? A flush crept into Henderson's cheeks, and a silence fell in the room. He glanced down, opened the folder on his lap again. At length, he spoke again. You are to be released, and you will be allowed to publish your story. You can take it to Pearson's magazine as you planned, and yes, you can publish. But know this, the War Office will monitor your efforts and intervene as necessary. You can tell your story, but you can only tell it as fiction. If word were to get out this was real, there exists somewhere beings with a technology greater than the British Empire's. Well, if people were to believe such a thing were true, it would prompt widespread panic, sir, I assure you. So, yes, you may publish. Yes, you may put your name to it. And yes, you might even become acclaimed for what you have written. People may come to know the name Herbert George Wells for his daring works of speculation. But, sir, let one word of this come to be known as true, and the War Office will intervene, and you would not like our intervention. I bowed my head, biting my tongue as I listened to his screed. The restraint spit at my arm as I strained, as I longed to stand up and strike him. Government office be damned. And Huxley, I snarled, finally. What of him? What did he do wrong that made you lie about how he died? Henderson adjusted his tie. We didn't lie, he said calmly. We told the truth. Well, mostly. We may have changed the location of where he died for purposes of national security. He died of a heart attack brought on by... He gestured towards Loeffler. What was it you said? Loeffler folded his arms, a grim look on his face. Old colleague, I said there was one area we got lucky, but I didn't finish telling you the whole story, he said. I looked at him, unsure now as he spoke. With all that had gone wrong, what could be worse? You may be wondering why we kept you here so long before coming to you. A week we kept you. We had to be sure. Sure, I asked. Sure of what, man? We were lucky in the bacteria that killed the Martians. But where we were not so lucky is that they brought bacteria of their own. As ours killed them, so theirs began to affect those at the site, and those they touched, as they moved away from the scene. The bacteria was not so virulent it seemed as the type that wrought such damage on our visitors, but it was enough to do serious harm. Huxley was an old man. He was one of the first to be affected by it. It acted as a kind of influenza. With his age, it brought on a heart attack. Exactly as it said in the newspaper, I thought. So, they didn't lie. They just didn't tell the entire truth. And this bacteria, I asked, how is it affecting others? Badly, said Loeffler. Those exposed to it, especially the infirm, the results have not been good. It has only been a week, but of those exposed, perhaps 5 to 10 in 100 has been in danger of death. 5 to 10, I gasped. If not contained, that would be... And I stopped, as I thought of my journey from the site, of my cough, and my ache, and all the people I had met. I looked Loeffler in the eyes. Was I? Did I? He nodded grimly. We are trying to contain it as best as possible, but there is only so much we can do. This Martian flu is out there. We hope it will perish by itself, not find a way to strengthen, or perhaps our bodies will build up defenses over time. But yes, it exists, and we must see how it resolves. Henderson broke in again. Of course, Mr. Wells, your story will not need to reflect that, and any mention of a Martian flu will be scrubbed by our censors. For the record, not that there is one for this meeting, but we shall also never refer to this this disease, by this name ever again. The War Office has assigned another name entirely to it, and we sincerely hope this is the last we ever hear of it. I paused, letting it sink in that I had unwittingly carried those germs out into the world. I thought back to the artilleryman, the people on the train, the curate, the landlord and his helper, the people on the omnibus, the cab driver, even the Coldstream guard who had struck me down. At length, I found words to ask one more thing. "What is it?" I asked. Henderson looked at me with annoyance. "What is what, Mr. Wells?" "What is the name?" I said, fixing him with a stare. "What are you calling the way this disease affects people? How will I know if I hear of it starting to have a wider effect?" He stood up, brushed himself down, the two men at his flanks rising also, and called for the guard to open the door. "I promise you will hear no such thing, Mr. Wells," he said as the door clunked open. "And you will all be released. You will be released in the next few days when you have been given the all clear. But the name is really just a simple substitution. Take out one point of origin, switch in another. Rather clever, really. Keep the same effect, but strip out the fear of the unknown. Henceforth it will simply be known by two words." The others shuffled out ahead of him, and he turned to smile his thin smile back at me before he left the room, for me to never see again. "It's Spanish flu." And that was The Secret War. It was written before the strange times we now live in, before the pandemic that came around. This one not coming from Mars. At least I assume so. As you probably can tell, it's a spin on The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. My idea for it was, what if the Martians really did come to Earth? What if H.G. Wells was trying to write a story based upon a real event? And so that's how The Secret War was born, and that's the story you've just listened to. I hope you enjoyed it. As I say, there are submissions open at present for the latest alternate history anthology from Inklings Press. You can find out more about that on www.inklingspress.com. Submissions end at the month of March, at the end of the month. Thank you very much for listening, and I might well return to read a different story. Who knows, perhaps one I might submit for Tales from Alternate Earths 3. We shall see. Good night.